Hello and welcome back. Today we will be talking about industry analysis, and this is one of the key topics in explaining the environment within which firms make their strategies. So let me pull up my slides again. And the reason we're going to look at that is that when firms develop their strategies, they develop them within the constraints of the general environment and their industry environment. Their industry also determines who the competition is. And as you remember, the goal of you as a strategic manager is to ensure above average returns. Above average returns are determined in relation to what your competitors make. So it's very important to understand who the competition is, what drives them, and what you can do to outperform them. So in terms of the lecture highlights, we will talk about general environment, and then specifically about the industry analysis. We'll actually spend quite some time talking about making sense of your industry and how industry affects your strategic choices and your options. We'll talk about using industry analysis to forecast industry profitability. We'll talk about the effects of those discoveries with respect to industry profitability for your strategy and identifying key success factors that operate within your industry. And then we'll switch gears a little bit. We'll talk about, how much does industry actually matter? So sure, it puts some constraints on what we do and what we maybe should be doing or shouldn't be doing, but how much difference does it make and what implications it has for us as strategy makers, as decision makers for companies. We'll expand the major framework that is typically used for industry analysis. And then we'll talk a little bit about competitive dynamics, trying to assess the likelihood of competitive actions on someone's part, or maybe trying to understand the likelihood of a competitive response when we launch our actions against our competitors. We'll talk about different ways of dealing with competition, and we'll conclude by talking about segmentation and strategic group analysis, because very often it is not necessary, strictly speaking, to talk about industry at large. It is essential to understand that little segment where you're going to play and build your strategies with respect to what's happening in that specific segment. So we're going to start with general environment. And when we talk about general environment, this is the most broad definition of forces that could affect your company. In the basic sense, general environment affects all firms in all industries, and we're particularly interested in changes and trends, but it should be noted that those trends are not equally important to each industry or to each firm in those industries. So to make sense of general environment, there's a useful acronym that I want you to remember, PEST. It stands for political, economic, social, and technological factors. So basically, it simply gives you a framework to describe what happens outside of the firm and outside of the industry as well. So, political things like new regulations or maybe some global accords that try to increase effectiveness of certain resource usage or combat global warming, things of that nature could potentially affect a lot of different businesses and a lot of different industries, sometimes in unpredictable ways. Think about all the attempts to renegotiate NAFTA and other global agreements. Well, obviously that has implications for a lot of businesses, from farmers to high tech. Any attempts to bring businesses back to the States, right, something known as reshoring, and there's been a lot of attempts to do that recently, that also has implications for how businesses operate and what additional constraints they face, or maybe the opportunities they get out of it. So you all have heard about SWOT analysis. This is one of the tools that some people use when describing strategy, when trying to help firms to develop a viable set of options. You probably remember it stands for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. So in this SWOT analysis framework, general environment refers to opportunities and threats. We're not going to talk much about SWOT analysis in this class, mainly because to a lot of scholars, a lot of researchers, they're kind of disappointed at that. It does have its benefits, but its use does not really lead to any straightforward recommendations. So, but again, in that framework, this general environment analysis is covered by opportunities and threats. And once again, when we describe this general environment, we are primarily interested in changes in each of those factors. If there's no change, firms eventually do find their equilibrium, right? It's changes that can bring about new opportunities or new threats. And it is those changes that we have to somehow take into consideration when developing our strategy. And what's important is that these different segments of general environment, they do have impact on what we perceive and what happens within our specific industries, right? And primarily what happens with our suppliers, competitors, and customers. And those three elements are absolutely key to understanding how your industry behaves, what you can expect, what you should expect, and what you can do about what you see within your industry. So industries basically differ in the amount of profits, or the profitability rates of returns that they allow the firms to sustain. And there are five forces of competition, they are called sometimes, that affect industry attractiveness. This whole framework has been developed by Michael Porter, and it is also sometimes referred to as Porter's five forces or Porter's framework. So when you hear those terms, you just know what they mean. And basically what this framework suggests is that these five forces shape industry attractiveness, which means the level of profitability that a firm can expect to sustain over the long run. These forces are buyers and suppliers, specifically bargaining power of buyers and suppliers, threat of substitute products, threat of new entrants, and then within the industry, rivalry among existing firms. So let's discuss those forces one by one. And we're going to start with substitute products, primarily because in all my years of teaching, I've seen that this one is probably most misunderstood by students and by a lot of other people. So when we talk about substitutes, we typically talk about products that are in different product category that may still satisfy the same need. And so when you look at airlines and let's say Delta, and you try to figure out what the substitute products are for Delta, we're not going to look at Southwest. We're not going to look at United, right? Because that would be competition within the industry, and that's a different force. Here we're going to look at things like car travel, or Greyhound, or right now with all the travel bans and social distancing, maybe we're going to look at Zoom, right? So Zoom could be seen as a substitute product to Southwest and Delta in some ways. So it is very important to not confuse substitute products with products offered by rivals. Those are different categories. And essentially, if your industry is such where substitute products are plenty, that negatively affects attractiveness of your industry. It does not allow firms to sustain high enough profits in the long run. So that is very important. The other thing that we need to look at, the one that's also misunderstood quite a lot, is entry barriers, and specifically threat of new entry into your industry. Often when I ask my students, where would you like to start your business? Many of them say, I would start a restaurant, or I would do this, I would do that. Why? Because it's easy, right? So they think it's a good thing, It's easy to get into the industry. It's easy to get the resources needed to compete. And that is true. But what it means for you, it's not easy just for you. It's easy for everybody else. So everybody else would be doing that. And when there are too many entries into your industry, obviously, supply, demand, and all of those things kick in, and the profitability levels that you can sustain reduce dramatically. This is why you see so many restaurants go out of business very fast. So you want to be in the industry that has high entry barriers, because that tends to increase industry attractiveness. When do industries have those high entry barriers? When is it hard for new guys to get in? Well, obviously, this is sort of the most expected one, capital requirements. If the industry is so complex that you really need to make fantastic investments to get in, unlike making airplanes, you don't really see too many startups trying to do that. Like in this global aircraft making industry, there are just two main players, Boeing and Airbus. Right, there are some smaller companies, like there's someone in Canada, there's Embraer in Brazil, there are some companies in China, some in Russia, but globally, we really talk about just two competitors. And this is because the level of technology is such that it is almost impossible for a new entrant to come in and start doing that. It is also because the market is not large enough to sustain more than these two major players. So again, you read the textbook, I assume. There was this example with a super jumbo airplane, Airbus 380. The global market for those planes was estimated at a level where only one of the companies, the one who started it first, would be able to get enough of the market to justify the investments. Now, it turns out Airbus has made a mistake when they estimated the market at what it was. And, Boeing is probably very happy that they didn't follow suit. But that just serves to illustrate the point. If capital requirements are such that you need this huge market, that you need enormous investments, that definitely protects you from new entrants, that makes the industry more attractive for you once you're already there. Economies of scale is kind of a very similar notion. For many products, the levels of production that you have to justify the investments, to spread the cost among all the units that you manufacture, are such that it is hard for a new entrant to get any sort of competitive advantage once it enters the market or gets into the industry. So the example from the textbook, for car manufacturers, they estimate that to justify a new model, they need to project sales of at least 6 million cars. And 6 million cars is a lot, right? So if you're a startup, if you're Tesla, you're definitely challenged by that. So Tesla seem to have gotten around it. But again, you don't see too many new car manufacturers entering the industry every now and then. Consumer electronics, right? So I don't know, your flat screen TVs, there's very few manufacturers globally that make those, because the volume that is required to justify the investments and the scale economies that come with that volume are such that you have to have access to that market. And for a new startup, without all the connections and experience, it becomes virtually impossible. In many high-tech industries, the minimum size of the market, so the population size that you need to be successful, is about 200 million people, which means that firms that could become competitive could only come from a few places, right? A place like the United States with over 300 million population, place like European Union, with what, about 500 million people, China, India, and that's about all, right? So I come from Russia, and I do have my hopes for that country that one day it will be doing better than it's doing now. But just from pure economics, Russia's population is about 150 million people. It's just not feasible. For many industries, it is simply not feasible to have national players that would be able to compete on par with global ones, because the domestic market is just not big enough. So it will not sustain that company. And this is why trading blocks are so important, right? This is why European Union was such an improvement for all those smaller European nations. This is why we talk about the importance of NAFTA and other things. So economies of scale, right? They require certain investments. They require that there is this market that you occupy. So that's that. There are also absolute cost advantages that some companies have. And if you have those players in your industry, then, I'm sorry to say, you probably would be outcompeted. If you're dealing with some natural resources, companies that were able to claim certain areas first would always have an advantage, right? If you were in Saudi Arabia, you have all the oil in the world that you want, and that's that, right? You'll always get it the cheapest and the best quality, and that's just that. It will always give you some sort of advantage. Product differentiation. If you happen to be in an industry where products are differentiated, that's a good thing, right? You start getting in trouble if you're dealing in commodities. When you deal in commodities, everything depends on price. The nature of competition shifts the price, which means competition drives out those profits. And statistically speaking, you're not really making any money worth of even thinking. So you want to be in an industry that implies differentiation, that encourages differentiation, that allows companies to charge premium from the loyal customers. So that's essential. Access to distribution channels used to mean really a great deal. So you really needed to be able to, put your products on shelves in supermarkets and whatnot. Now with the development of the internet, that is definitely not as critical as it once used to be. There are many companies that are able to penetrate well-developed industries, mature industries with innovative products, and circumvent all of those traditional distribution channels. There's this deodorant. I was listening to a podcast, and the entrepreneur who came up with it wanted to do something that's like completely natural, has no aluminum, nothing of that nature, and they did come up with a product that had superior properties. They were selling it over the internet, right? They did not employ any major distribution networks to get their business off the ground. So I think it's called Native or something like that. And at this point, the company is developed enough. You can actually find their products now at Walmart. I think I've seen it. It's a lot more expensive than the traditional product. But again, that lack of access initially to the distribution channel did not deter the company from entering the industry. Previously, it would have been almost an insurmountable roadblock to that company's success. So the importance of this specific one goes down over time. Governmental barriers and all sorts of regulations. Many industries are regulated, right? So my first wife was a hairdresser, and she trained to be a hairdresser in the U.S. I was absolutely shocked to find out the licensing requirements. So that happened while we lived in Ohio. And apparently over there, you have to go through training of, I think, at least 1,500 hours, and then 1,800 hours if you also want to have a manager license. And back in Russia, I think they go through like 200 hours training, and they work just as well. So that's the way for the industry to keep new entrants out, right? This is how they artificially limit the opportunities. They make it difficult for others to enter. And the government supports it for whatever reason. Again, probably don't want to go into that, but if there are some government barriers, if you TikTok trying to do business in the States and there's this new regulation saying that no, you can't unless a US company buys you, that's definitely a strong government barrier. And there are some industries, there are many industries, there are those barriers put in place by the governments at all levels. Retaliation. If you are thinking of entering the industry where major players are known to retaliate fiercely, now think again. You see this little Mickey Mouse here on the slide, and the reason I put it here is that, so you all know Disney World, right, or Disney company, and we think of them as, sort of this fuzzy, white, nice company that makes kids happy, and maybe some parents too. Well, in reality, they are known to be very strict to any sorts of, copyright violations. So there's a story that I like very much about a child care program in Chicago. I would imagine South Side. It was a church-run program, so very sort of poor facility, basement of the church. To make things better for kids, some of the parents came and put drawings of Disney characters on the walls. Well, kids like those characters, so nothing wrong with that. Somehow Disney got the word of it. They sued the place. And, I don't know exactly what kind of lesson they were trying to teach to this child care program, but if you know that there is this player who would retaliate no matter what, you would think twice, right? And being in an industry where there are players like that makes an industry more attractive because it keeps people out, it keeps newcomers out, which means, there are fewer players to divide the pie between. And then finally, switching costs. If you happen to be in an industry that is subject to switching costs, that's a good thing. For the longest while, I was a Windows user, and I had, back in 2006, I think, a very traumatic experience with my Dell laptop. Dell and Mac, and that was all, and I've never used Mac. So I got myself a Dell. It died on me so many times. Maybe it was just a defective unit, I don't know. So when the time came for a tech refresh, I opted for Mac, and especially because I knew you could run Windows on the same computer. And that's what I was doing, and it was working really well. And then one day I was traveling internationally, flying to Sweden. That was when security measures were really tough. And, like at airports, they would ask you to open your laptop to make sure that it works, that it's really nothing other than a laptop. And so they asked me to open it and start it, which I did. And I got that blue screen of death that most of you Microsoft users know. And so my Windows partition crashed. I ended up being stuck in Sweden for about 2 weeks with no access to any technical help. I could still run my computer on the Mac partition. So I had to give myself a crash course, and I ended up switching, and I've been using Apple MacBooks ever since. But without that experience, right, the switching cost, the need for me to learn this new thing were such that I wouldn't consider it, right? So it just happened the way it did. And if you happen to be in an industry where switching costs are high for people, for whatever reason, right? It could be investment in some proprietary thing, then that is something that makes the industry more attractive. It means that the profit levels the firm sustain would be higher. And then rivalry between established competitors. That is something that typically comes to mind when we think about competition and industry environment. Obviously, when it is intense, it reduces industry attractiveness and industry ability to sustain high returns. Industry could be intensely competitive when there's high concentration, well, depending, I guess, on concentration. So if the industry is concentrated, which means there are few firms, but they're really large and they control a big chunk of market, each of them, then that's actually a good thing for you as an industry, right? It means that sometimes those firms, they form collusion of some sort, tacit or explicit. Sometimes they just understand each other so well. Sometimes they understand that, by launching attacks against each other, they, effectively damaging each other's profitability. So they kind of stay away from that. If the industry is not concentrated at all, if there are many small players and nobody really controls a big chunk of it, this is when competition gets really, really ugly. Right? This is when people try to compete on price. They engage in all sorts of questionable behaviors. So concentration is actually good for you if you're in an industry. It guarantees that your returns will be higher than they could otherwise be. Diversity of competitors is a thing that is not necessarily helpful. Again, if there's limited number of players and they all are pretty much alike, they understand each other, they kind of think alike, it's easy for them to come to that tacit or explicit collusion. If they're really diverse, then you never really know what to expect from each of the players. And that changes your attitude, that changes their attitude. Competition gets more intense. Product differentiation is the thing that helps. Again, same thing as I said before, if the product is differentiated for most companies within each industry, then they kind of insulated from the ugliest of rivalries. If everybody deals in commodities, price is the only way to compete. And this is when obviously the profitability levels in the industry go down. If there's excess capacity in the industry, if there are major industry players that have facilities that could produce a lot more than what the market demands, it means they would go out of their way to, at least load those facilities to some extent, because they have those high fixed costs. They need to spread those among as many units of products as possible, which again will drive prices down. Chances are everybody will be losing money. It's just they wouldn't be losing quite as much money as they could have otherwise. And because of that, they will try to, use all the capacity available. But again, that's hurtful for the industry and for the levels of profitability it allows. Exit barriers, that's an interesting thing. Right, so previously we talked about entry barriers and how having high entry barriers is actually a good thing for industry attractiveness. With exit barriers, the situation is actually opposite. Sometimes if your equipment is so specialized, you can only use it for one purpose. Right? If there's not enough demand, there's really nothing you can do other than slashing down your prices dramatically and trying to at least fight for some chunk of the market. If you have the machinery that can be retooled to manufacture whatever, then you're insulated from that, right? You may supply different kind of companies, even different kind of industries, different kind of buyers. So if your industry has high exit barriers, that's a bad thing for industry attractiveness. Scale economies, we kind of talked about those before, and this fixed to variable cost ratio, which is related to excess capacity, in a way, if your industry is such where companies have high fixed costs and low variable costs, they will do everything they can to cover at least some of those fixed costs. even if they lose money on each unit they sell, they're not going to lose as much money as they would if they don't sell anything, right? So if your industry is a different one, the one that has high variable costs, then you don't really have the fixed costs you need to cover, right? So again, guys, I assume you know the difference between fixed costs and variable costs. I assume you had your accounting classes or whatever else you might cover that stuff. If not, please let me know. Please send me an email, give me some feedback, and I'll talk about that as well. But if you happen to be in an industry where fixed costs are especially high, that is not good for the industry because that will drive down the returns that industry companies may sustain. And then finally, bargaining power of buyers and suppliers. And it actually makes sense to discuss it together for a few reasons. But the main is that, as an industry firm, you act as both buyer and supplier. You buy something from your own suppliers, you manufacture whatever it is you do, and then you sell it to whoever it is you sell your stuff to. So as an industry firm, you will find yourself in both roles, and it's just important to understand this relative bargaining power of companies that supply you, and then whoever buys your stuff against your company or against a typical industry firm. So typically, companies have, let's say, your suppliers. Suppliers will have bargaining power over you if their industry is more concentrated than yours. There's very few suppliers, each of whom controls a big chunk of the market. It's really hard for you, the smaller guy, to negotiate, right? So as well, the ultimate case, you need to get something from the government, some quota, some license or anything. There's really no negotiation. You have to pay whatever you have to pay, right? If there's one specific resource that you buy, I think U.S.A. talked about iron ore. Once that industry has concentrated, the price they were able to charge from their buyers has gone up tremendously. Why? Because they could. Now they had the power. Buyer information. So when the best example I can think of is buying a new car at a dealership. It's my understanding that dealers want to make this market as non-transparent as possible. And there are all those secondary websites that provide you with all the information if you know the right places. So over the years, I bought, I think, 8 new cars in the States. That's what, past maybe 20 years. I've never once paid more than invoice. And if you go to the dealership, they would always start talking from MSRP, right? This manufacturer suggested retail price. It's only because the information, their invoice price and other incentives is now generally available to the public that we can get better deals from them, right? We now have that extra power we can wield against those companies to get a deal that we can live happy afterwards. So that is essential. The other reason why your buyers may have some power over you is, let's say you supply some critical resource to another company and you try to charge whatever you feel like charging. If that company may establish presence in your industry instead and start supplying themselves with that same resource, now that's a very different proposition. Then you will think twice, do you want to have a new competitor in your industry? Do you want to lose them as a customer? Maybe it's better for you to drop your price a little bit so that they remain, as they are, and you maintain business as usual. They don't necessarily have to go ahead and, start supplying themselves with whatever You try to sell them, but the threat of them doing so has to be credible enough for you to actually act on it and give them better prices. So there's a credible threat that they may do it themselves. You're probably going to give them better prices. Makes sense. And finally, there are instances when buyers are especially price sensitive. And when that happens, they will put a lot of pressure on you. They will demand price concessions, and they may switch to another supplier if you're not willing to budge. So when does that happen? If the product that you supply, and let's say you supply another firm that makes something, if that represents a major chunk of their cost, or the cost of their product, right? So the example that your textbook was given is like aluminum cans for soft drinks manufacturers or beer manufacturers. Apparently, aluminum costs weigh a lot. I mean, in terms of cost. So some of those companies, rather than buying aluminum or those cans from third parties, develop their own facilities to take care of the problem, right? So when that happens, if buyers are really sensitive to that, they will demand that you keep prices as low as possible. On the other hand, if what you supply is greatly important for their product success, you can get away with a lot. So, if you're manufacturing personal computers, obviously computer chips are critical. And for that reason, companies like Intel and AMD can charge decent amount for their products that then gives them enough money to fuel into further research and development. So they keep producing better and better and more expensive processors for all of us to absorb later on as customers. If the products that your industry offers are not differentiated, obviously it's very easy for people to switch from you to competitor. I'm currently in California, of all places, and one thing I've noticed here is that gas prices are ridiculously different across different gas stations. So prior to that, so when I'm in Minnesota, when I used to live in Ohio, I was a very loyal person to a specific brand, actually to a specific gas pump. No real reason to it. It was close to the house. I was always going there, It was on my way to work or from work home. So I would always stop at that same spot, fill up and never really think about the price much because everybody was charging the same price. Here, well, California is generally more expensive when it comes to gasoline. So one gas station could be charging $2.99 per gallon, and the one just 100 feet across will be charging $3.35. So at that point, my loyalty to a specific gas station or to a specific pump, goes out like that. I don't care then about where exactly I'm getting my gas from because that difference is really substantial. So that's the bad news for the industry. If the product is really commoditized, not much hope. And then sometimes if you supply another industry which is fiercely competitive, like those firms that you supply, they're really between a rock and a hard place. So they will demand price concessions from you because otherwise they could go out of business. And you realize that, and you don't want them to go out of business because you want to supply as many firms as you can. So you kind of have to meet them at least halfway and help them out a little bit. So that's that. So those were the 5 forces of competition, a traditional model that you probably will get taught at any business school across the country and probably around the world. So what do you do with that? It helps you understand, again, the extent to which the industry is attractive, the extent to which it may sustain above average returns. The good thing about this tool is that you can use it to forecast industry profitability into the future. And remember, when you talk about developing a strategy, you're always looking into the future. Strategic decisions, they always imply some long-term commitment. So you have to have an idea of where the industry might be, a few years from now. You do that by first identifying the current industry structure. You identify how those forces are aligned. Then you look at the trends, right? You look at what happened recently, what's happening currently, and how current profitability is a consequence of the industry's current structure, where the trends are taking the industry structure, and what those trends mean to the 5 forces of competition and result in profitability of the industry. So if you know that, there's a major development in some other industry that would make a number of substitutes for the product that you currently make, you know that, a few years from now, your industry will become less attractive. A lot of people will switch, right? If, think about GPS manufacturers. For a while, companies like TomTom and Garmin, the ones that were making those standalone units that you can put in a vehicle, they were probably enjoying their life until there was a substitute in cell phones, right? Smartphones. So if you know that something which is clearly a substitute product, if you know something like that happening, you can forecast that the industry profitability is going to go down, right? So what can you do to deal with it? So how does it affect your strategy? Obviously, there are several options to choose from. Again, I told you in strategic management, we try to make it simple. Everything is two of these and three of that. So here we also have two major kind of responses. One is just, trying to accept the trends and try to position the company appropriately. It turns out that industries are rarely homogeneous, right? There are different segments, there are pockets where competitive forces are weakest. So if you find one of those, you may simply position your company there. And, if the segment is small enough, it will not be of interest to major players. They will not come in there and try to compete everything away from you. So you can have a pretty decent, happy life. You will not be able to grow particularly impressively, but, if you position the company right, you can have, again, decent life for a while. You may even use that to establish a foothold in the industry and then start expanding from that foothold into other segments. It's something that they term mobility across segments. So when you think about Japanese car manufacturers, right, companies like Honda, they initially entered with what? Light motorcycles, the market that was really not of interest to anyone else at the time in the States. They switched to heavier motorcycles, they switched to small cars that were not really of interest to manufacturers at that time, right? The big three US manufacturers. It's really impossible to know whether it was a brilliant strategy or just a stroke of luck. But obviously, with the oil crisis back in the 70s, people started realizing that, getting yourself a gas guzzler maybe is not a good idea. So people started switching to those cars, which increased their market share, which increased the amount of money they had and the amount they could put into new product development. So like all of those changes, all of those trends have created an opportunity that those companies were able to capitalize on quite successfully. The other approach, the more active approach, is you may try to develop strategies to alter industry structure, right? So you may try to do something that builds entry barriers. If your industry does not have a professional association, well, maybe you start one, right? So I told you about my first wife and the hairstyle business. that's definitely a strategy thought of by someone to make industry more attractive. Um, if competition, if rivalry is a major concern, well, then maybe you start thinking about integration, right? You either acquire your competitors or maybe you create joint ventures, alliances of some sort, something that's known as co-opetition, right? So this is cooperation among competitors. Maybe you try to create sort of artificial bottlenecks in your industry. One of the reasons Apple is so successful with its, whole iTunes, iPods and whatnot, is that they lock the customer in to a respective music format that is not transferable directly to other manufacturer standards. I started using iPhones. I don't even remember when. So my first one was 4S. So probably 2011, something like that. And I was basically happy with the product, but I was thinking about switching away from it to Android for a while. And every time, the minute I start thinking about my music collection, which is rather eclectic, and I have like all sorts of stuff on my phone, like I know I'm gonna lose all that. So I keep loyal to Apple, to iPhones, for all those years for no reason other than this creation of an artificial bottleneck by Apple. The other thing you can do to make the industry more attractive to you, right, to sort of a strategy you can develop to improve your own position in the industry, is you try to relieve the bottlenecks created by others, right? So this is what Google has done with its Android system. The whole smartphone, app market was controlled by Apple for a while. And they created their own system, which encouraged app developers to, work with them because that was free, and that enabled this other standard to become equally profitable. Actually, it's more popular right now than Apple, although Apple probably gets more money from what it does. But again, trying to change that industry structure by relieving bottlenecks created by others is a great competitive response. And then sometimes you also try to redefine the roles and responsibilities in the industry. So you sort of change how the industry operates. And the textbook gives you this example of IKEA, which I think is really brilliant. Prior to IKEA, to get a piece of furniture, you go to a store, there's a showroom, you find what you want, you order delivery, you probably wait like a week until it gets there. It's expensive, it's hopefully beautiful, hopefully it serves you a long time. When IKEA came, well, they sell flat boxes. You hold them yourself, you put the furniture together yourself. It doesn't serve quite as long. The designs, there are different opinions about IKEA designs. I hate some of it, I love some of it. I know it doesn't last quite as long, but again, it costs so little that people are willing to change the ways they go about doing business, like in that industry, and that has been extremely successful for IKEA. So you can do that. You change the industry by redefining roles and responsibilities within the industry. It's good for your business. And so, with all of that in mind, how do we determine key success factors in the industry? And what does it mean to our strategies? So basically, again, you want to understand your customers, you want to understand your competition. With the customers, you're primarily interested in, well, who they are, obviously, but also what do they want. And it turns out that, well, it's fairly easy to distill, right? There are many things that they could potentially want, but there are very few things they would be willing to pay for. I had a good friend who was an airline pilot. He was flying for Continental back 10 years ago. I think it got acquired by United. And at some point, they were still an independent company. They were losing their market share. They try to understand what it is they can do for the customers to sort of, win them back. And so they ask their customers for features they would like to see, what the company was offering. And people were listing, like all of those things, bigger seats, more legroom, food, this and that. And then they thought to ask another question. Which of the services you would be willing to pay for? And the answers came very different from what they got from the first survey. So obviously, what people want, what creates value for the people, and this consumer surplus they get, something we talked about last time, right? It usually boils down to a few very simple things. You understand that, you're good. And then you also have to understand how does the firm survive competition, right? You have to analyze your competition, what drives your competitors, main dimensions of competition, how intense is competition, how can we obtain superior competitive position within that industry, and from that, right, you try to match the first and the second one. You come up with, 2, 3 critical success factors that you could apply to be successful in the industry. The funny thing is, you have multiple companies within the same industry looking at all those same forces and trying to come up with the same answers, yet the strategies they develop are not always the same, which is a good thing, right? Which means that there are multiple ways you can serve your customers profitably. So don't necessarily assume that what your competition does, you have to repeat. You may have alternative approaches to doing that. And the textbook lists, I believe, 3 examples of how that can be applied to real life companies. I definitely encourage you to read that and to think about it. And so that said, right, we talked about how industry is important and all those 5 forces of competition. How much does industry really matter? So you remember that, again, last time we talked about 2 kinds of strategies that a firm needs to develop. Corporate strategy, which basically tells you where you're going to compete, and then competitive strategy or business level strategy, which tells you how you're going to compete. So typically, when we think about industry analysis, you do it primarily to identify attractive industries. If you're a company like General Electric, they have this policy, they would only go into an industry that's obviously attractive, where they can be a number 1 or number 2 player. But they have the pockets, they can choose the industries as they please. For most other companies, it's not quite so easy. So does that mean that industry analysis is not terribly important? Right, so industry effects are responsible for about 20% of your company performance. Now, your internal resources and capabilities explain probably about 30%, which means there's 50%, which is completely white noise, unexplained, random luck or lack of luck. Does it mean we should discount the importance of industry analysis? Not at all. Right, so in this slide, you see all those different studies documented the importance of industry, and it explains anywhere from 5 to 20% of your company's profitability, which doesn't seem like a lot. Well, first of all, it is important, and because some industries have such low return on equity, 20% can make a lot of difference. But the other reason that industry analysis is so important is it not only helps you select the right industry, but it helps you develop a right competitive strategy within your industry, right? So don't think of it only as a way to identify attractive industries to go to. it is also a way to think about your competitive strategy for the industry you're currently in. And that is critically important. Now, it also turns out that this 5 forces framework that we just discussed, well, it's good, it's popular and everything, but there are things that it leaves sort of outside of consideration. There's one other critically important force that you would be smart to consider, and that's complements, right? So complementary products. We talked about substitute products and how they are potentially bad for your company and for the industry attractiveness. Well, if your industry is such where for the products that you make, there are important complements, then that drastically increases the attractiveness of your industry. If you make smartphones, and there's this whole separate industry of apps that are developed for your proprietary standard, okay, maybe not proprietary, but open standard, that affects attractiveness of the industry quite significantly. So I told you how, I got sucked into using iPhones, right? And now I'm not really able to switch because of all those apps and music and everything. But that happens left and right with many companies, with many industries. If you think about if you can come up with a product that will naturally have, that you can help have some complements outside, that's definitely good. That's definitely going to increase the attractiveness of your industry. And that would be a strategic choice that you should definitely go for if that is available. And so with all of that, we can now talk about competitive dynamics, right? When we say competitive dynamics, we primarily mean all those competitive actions and competitive responses that happen within the industry. And it is really important for us as an industry firm to understand the likelihood of a competitive attack so that we know if we need to respond or not. And if we are the one launching the attack, we need to be able to assess the likelihood of a competitive response. So let's talk about that. First of all, the likelihood of a competitive attack. A lot depends on who is likely to win. First mover or late movers, right? Second movers, late movers, whatever. We are conditioned to believe that first movers always have advantages. That, if you're a pioneer, you establish yourself a market, and then, you live there happily ever after. And a lot of talk about the blue ocean strategy, again, the term we used the previous week, and you probably hear that every now and then on different, shows, if you listen to podcasts. Seems to imply that, if you discover yourself in your market, if you create a new product, then that's what you can expect. The reality is it's true in some cases, it's not true in many other cases. And it's very hard, it's almost impossible to say who's going to be the winner until after the fact. So I have this slide here. I hope you can see that well. It's not really important just to illustrate a bunch of different products, innovators, followers, and who ended up as a winner. You can clearly see that in most cases, it's not the pioneer, it's not the first mover that has the ultimate advantage. Think about, again, iPods. An MP3 player, right, is what it is. Apple was by no means the first company that introduced MP3 players. Right, there were MP3 players well before Apple. Yeah, probably with a limited storage capacity and maybe some unfortunate interface. I had some of those, but they were definitely not a pioneer. In most products that you can think of, the company that is now the leading manufacturer was not a market leader, was not the first mover. Which means, unless you happen to be in the industry where being the first is definitely the best idea, then the likelihood of a competitive attack is not terribly strong. The other thing is, if you happen to have competitors who are known for their quality, it means they have probably built a successful differentiation, which means they have loyal customers and they're able to charge premiums. That gives them some extra cash in their pockets, right? Slack resources to launch yet another attack. So an attack from a company like that is very likely to come, right? So this is why when you think of Apple, and it seems we're talking a lot about Apple today, that's the reason why they come up with quite a few of those innovative products, right? They build a loyal customer base. They command higher prices. It gives them more resources to invest in innovation. Boom, right? They do it again. And conversely to that, organizational size, so it's an attack is more likely to come from a small company. And big guys, they typically sort of have this understanding. They are, in some ways, they may be too big to fail. Disruption of an industry could even happen if a big guy goes out of the business. So they are not likely necessarily to be super fierce against the rivals. It's usually the small company that comes and, it cannot really compete with established incumbents at the same playing field. So then they start inventing ways to maybe circumvent some of the industry protocols, to redefine how the industry operates, to blur industry boundaries, to start competing in a place where no one really expects anything, and then they just snatch some of the market away from rivals. So competitive attack is not very likely to come from a really large organization, right? They are complex to manage. They have a lot of things to worry about. So they're not the ones you should necessarily watch. Now, there are always exceptions. And that's, I guess, both a beauty and curse of teaching strategic management. I'm sure you can come up with counterexamples. Here I'm talking about sort of generalities, right? The big numbers. When you look across industries, across years, this is the pattern that you kind of see. And if you're the one launching an attack, you have to be able to assess the likelihood of a competitive response. And if what you do enables you to improve your capabilities use, if it causes damage to your rivals' capabilities or to their market position, they're very likely to respond. The other thing you have to take into account is the type of competitive action. And we haven't really talked much about it last time. There are two types of actions, strategic and tactical. So again, strategic actions imply serious commitment of resources. You cannot uncommit yourself necessarily, and it's very hard for rivals to imitate, to respond. Whereas tactical responses, something like slashing prices, or for airlines introducing loyalty programs, that does not, in and of itself, represent a serious commitment of any kind. So companies are a lot more likely to respond to a tactical attack than to a strategic one. Precisely because it's the commitment. They cannot necessarily respond easily to a strategic attack. And most of the attacks you're going to see, pricing or whatever, again, loyalty programs, they are tactical in nature, and they are the ones that likely to be responded. So if you want your attack to be uncontested, then launch a strategic attack, not a tactical one. Strength of the attack, that's an interesting one. So there's a story that I like very much about Intel and AMD. So you know that these two companies produce microprocessors used in computers. And historically, Intel was controlling about 80% of the market. AMD was a distant second with about 15% of the market. And the way the industry operated, Intel would invest a lot of money into developing the next generation of processors. AMD will reverse engineer those and will come up with their own versions about 6 months later. So, obviously, because Intel had sort of this leadership, this pioneer status, it had a lot of business with manufacturers of computers who always went for the latest and greatest. But AMD also had quite a loyal following who were getting good processor at decent prices. Now, how that is legal, I have no idea. I just know that somehow it is, and that they were able to successfully reverse engineer some of Intel's processors and make them work better than Intel. And that state of affairs lasted for many, many years until the industry came to a point where it was about to undergo a major technological shift. So up until that time, those processors were 32-bit processors, and the industry was getting ready to switch to 64-bit processors. And Intel thought it was a great opportunity for it to come up with an innovation that AMD will not be able to reverse engineer. So they wanted to change the processor architecture, like I'm not specialist there, but they wanted to create something that will not be backward compatible with all their other processors, which means, if you get this new processor from Intel, you have to reinstall all your software. The old one will not work. And they believe that if they do that, if they create a sufficiently complex architecture, then AMD will never be able to catch up, and they will get 95% of the market. AMD, when it heard about it, they kind of panicked. They realized they did not have the capabilities to reverse engineer that, and that there was a demand in the industry for 64-bit processors. There was all those pressures they were hearing from the customers. So for the first time in their history, they decided to innovate and not imitate. And unlike Intel, they developed a 64-bit processor that was backward compatible. So companies that installed it would not need to upgrade all of the software. They were much faster than Intel developing it, and it turned out to be much, much cheaper. So I think 3 to 4 times cheaper than what Intel was trying to charge for its processors. And because of this backward compatibility, customers definitely started preferring AMD's processors over Intel's. And for the first time in history, again, Intel was also in a situation where strategic options were unclear. And they really thought about it hard. Now, of course, they could have started imitating AMD, but that would have been quite a tragic story for them to live through. So they thought of a very different and a brilliant strategy. It turns out that both AMD and Intel, other than making processors, were also making memory drives, flash memory drives. And for Intel, that sales of memory represented about 7% of their profits or revenues, whereas for AMD's, that was about 50% of the revenues. So what Intel did, rather than trying to compete with them in the processor market, they slashed the prices on the memory they were selling. And yes, of course, they were losing money on each memory chip they were selling, but because it only represented 7% of their sales, it didn't really affect them much at all. Whereas for AMD, they lost effectively 50% of the revenue. They could no longer fund their R&D, so very quickly Intel was able to catch up and develop their newer, better, faster, cheaper processors, and the situation remained as it always was. So this is something that we call multi-market competition, where you can attack your competitor in a different market, trying to elicit a response where you need a response. So if that's something, if the strength of the attack against you is really critical, like the AMD's attack was against Intel, then you're definitely going to expect a response. Actor's reputation is very important. So, right, we talked about Disney, and like as a company, you know that you cannot compete with them in a specific way. Now, think about organized mafia, and one of the reasons they have such a free reign is, people know that if they do something against the mafia, there will be a response, right? Probably a violent one. So that reputation helps. And market dependence, if you launch an attack against someone and they really depend on the market, then there will be a response. So again, like the case with Intel has demonstrated. And what does it leave us with? So of course you can compete with your rivals. You may launch strategic attacks, you may launch tactical attacks, and you hope you do it in a smart way and they don't come after you. There are other ways, smarter ways of dealing with competitors. One is the so-called co-opetition, right, which is a cooperation among competitors. Happens all the time. And there are many industries where competitors routinely coordinate their activities. In Nordic countries, like Scandinavian countries, over 30% of all the startups, all businesses actually they are members of those networks of firms. And those networks combine firms that operate in the same industry within the same territory. And they work together on some innovative projects and they try to combine their efforts to be able to compete with giants. So, rather than trying to outdo each other competitively, they realize that they are in this together. They pool their efforts, sort of, live and let live mentality. And that's very good. Deterrence. You may simply deter your competitor from launching an attack against you. Really, the best example I can think of is, from geopolitics back 30 years ago, U.S. versus Soviet Union. There was a guarantee of mutual destruction. And because of that, none of the countries launched anything major, strategic against each other. Sure, there were those little tactical things here and there, but nothing really major, strategic, nuclear grade has ever happened because, you knew that, you could be dealt with one way or another. You may demonstrate commitment to a project, and that commitment will keep competitors from pursuing something similar. So like Airbus and Boeing, when Airbus committed to developing this A380 airplane, the double-decker, that was enough for Boeing to know not to go there because the global market was simply not big enough. So if you signal that, you're seriously doing something, if this commitment is believable, credible, then that will probably protect you against some actions or some responses from your competition. You may try to change the structure of the game. So this often happens when there is a standards war in the industry. Like not so many years ago, but still prior to Netflix, there was this HD DVD, high definition DVD standards war. And a lot of different companies were trying to come up with their standards and they were kind of competing against each other until they realized it's best if they actually co-develop something together, or if they join in with a company that has developed something, if they back up a specific standard, so Blu-ray in that case, as opposed to HD DVD by a competing group of firms. So, or Tesla offering to share their patents with anyone who is interested. That is also meant to grow the industry, to facilitate the development of complementary resources, right? So they try as many electric vehicles as possible so that people put those charging stations and whatnot to help create the environment. So this is changing the structure of the game. Then you also may send different signals, right? You maybe declare your strategic goals, or again, you make certain investments, or you launch some products that signal to your competitors and to your customers what it is that you're trying to do. And this is not necessarily a collusion, but this is an attempt to redefine the market, to educate the market, to make sure that you don't compete head to head with someone that, like every firm in the industry, has some room to develop and, I guess, appropriate some of the value that it creates for the customers. And to help understand your competitors, whether or not they will go with your game, whether or not they will go with your approach, you have to run a competitor analysis. Very specifically, there are 4 things you need to understand: their current strategy, their objectives, right? They could be after a different thing than you. They could be after a specific segment, whereas you can be after a different segment. Maybe you're not even competitors in a global sense. Maybe you should support each other rather than compete. You have to understand their assumptions, assumptions that they hold about the industry and themselves, because that will explain what kind of strategic actions they're likely to take so that you can prepare yourself. And then you have to know the resources and capabilities. And it's really when it comes to like strategy, you can figure it out. Objectives, they typically, you can find them in company reports and their websites and whatnot. Assumptions, resources, and capabilities are much trickier to assess. And this is where firms engage in competitive intelligence. And this is like really gray, shady area. How much is it intelligence or espionage? And then companies do get into trouble for that. So, read the book about it. I don't want to be responsible. And so once you do that, you can make your predictions as to what strategy changes will the competitor initiate, right? So the kind of competitive attacks you could expect, and how will the competitor respond to our initiatives, right? So again, and it's not just about attacks and responses, it's also about those other strategies, cooperation, deterrence, signaling, commitment, and other things. And so finally, so far we've been talking about industry as if it's just one big industry, and like as a car manufacturer, you have to analyze all other car manufacturers. Well, that's not exactly correct, right? Most companies that compete within an industry, they compete in a certain segment of that industry. And you should be a lot more concerned about your segment than you are about your entire industry. Right? There are some segments that are fairly insulated from competition. You find one of those, you're fine. So you do this segmentation by disaggregating the industry into specific markets. And it's important to conduct it because understanding customer needs across segments should inform your strategy, what you should be concerned about and what you shouldn't be concerned about. Right? If you're Tesla, you definitely have very different concerns than, GM. If you're GM, you have very different concerns than Jaguar. Even though you are still members of the same car manufacturing industry, the segments that you serve are different. The things that your customers want are different, and your competitors would do also different things, obviously. Apart from that, you also try to run a strategic group analysis. And what this one does, so rather than focusing on customers, here you look at competitors that have adopted similar approaches to competing within the industry, right? So here the focus is on competitors specifically. not so much customers, right? They're still important, right? They still determine the segments and everything, but you try to identify competitors that, rivals that try to compete in very similar ways, because it means they're subject to the same environmental constraints, they have the same resources. So when a challenge comes or an opportunity comes, you'll be in a tough spot, right? You're mutually vulnerable. Those will be the companies you need to watch very closely. So you have to identify them and keep a really close eye on them. And we'll definitely talk a lot more about other things you should keep an eye on. But I think that concludes it for the industry analysis. I encourage you again to read the textbook. We'll be discussing the case. I think it's Tesla case this week. So you'll see the questions posted at some point, I think on Tuesday. And you'll have enough time through the end of the week to send me your responses. So thanks again. As usual, if there's any feedback you'd like to send me, I'll appreciate that. Otherwise, guys, have a great day and good luck.